She had been telling them for 8 months that something was wrong. 8 months of appointments, reports, specialists, engineers, all of them looking at the same data, running the same diagnostics, arriving at the same conclusion. The chair is perfect. 8 months of a woman who had built a company from nothing being told, in the most polished and professional language possible, that what she was feeling wasn't real. Then a mechanic in a small-town garage heard something no one else had bothered to listen for, and everything changed. If this story moves you, hit that like button right now, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The smell of the garage in early October was something Mason Reed had stopped noticing years ago. Motor oil and rust, and the faint chemical bite of brake cleaner hanging in the cool air. So familiar, it had become something like background silence. He was underneath a 2019 pickup when the sound of tires on gravel pulled him back to the surface. Not car tires. Something smoother, more deliberate. He slid out from under the truck on the creeper board, wiping his hands on a shop rag that had already given up on being clean, and watched the black SUV pull into the lot. It was the kind of vehicle that made the other cars in his parking area look slightly embarrassed. Freshly detailed, tinted windows, the quiet authority of serious money. Mason sat up on the creeper and stayed where he was for a moment. He had learned over 11 years of running Reed's garage that people who drove cars like that either wanted everything done yesterday or were lost and needed directions to somewhere better. Either way, he wasn't in a hurry. The SUV's rear passenger door opened first. A woman stepped out, mid-30s, dark blazer. The kind of composure that suggested she spent a lot of time in rooms where decisions got made. She scanned the garage with an expression that wasn't quite disapproval, but was making room for it. Her eyes landed on Mason and stayed there for a beat too long before she looked back at the car. Then the side door opened wider, and the ramp came down. Mason stood up. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't a conscious decision, just the thing his body did, maybe because he was raised by a woman who believed in standing when something deserved your full attention. The wheelchair that emerged from the vehicle was not the kind of thing you saw in a small-town garage. It was matte black and precisely engineered, the frame thin and deliberate, with a joystick control mounted on the right armrest, and a display panel that glowed faintly even in the October daylight. It cost more than Mason had made in the last 3 years combined. He could tell that without knowing the brand, the way you can tell certain things from the way they carry themselves in a room. The woman in the chair was younger than the one who'd stepped out first. 30, maybe. Dark hair pulled back, not because it looked professional, but because it was out of her way. She had a stillness to her that most people don't have. Not peace exactly, more like the particular stillness of someone who has been very, very tired for a long time and stopped broadcasting it. She was looking at Mason with a directness that caught him slightly off guard. Not challenging, just honest. The kind of look that said, "I'm not going to pretend I don't notice you staring." He wasn't staring. He looked away and walked toward them. "Morning," he said. The woman in the blazer stepped forward. "Are you the owner?" "Yes, ma'am." "Vanessa Sterling." She didn't offer her hand. "This is my sister Avery. We were told you're the best mechanic in the county." Mason glanced around his lot, at the aging pickup up on the lift, the '94 Camry waiting for a head gasket, the coffee cup balanced on the hood of an F-150 that he'd forgotten about 2 hours ago. "Whoever told you that probably meant for cars," he said. "That's not what we need." Vanessa's gaze dropped briefly to the wheelchair. "The chair's the problem." Mason looked at it again, at her. "I don't work on wheelchairs." "I know." Vanessa's tone carried the careful precision of someone who had made this pitch before and was tired of making it. "Every certified mobility equipment specialist in the state has examined this chair. Every engineer at the manufacturer. 3 separate physical therapists. 2 physiatrists. They all say the same thing. The chair is functioning exactly as designed. There is no mechanical issue." "Okay," Mason said. "My sister says there is." A beat of quiet. Mason looked at Avery. She was watching the exchange without expression, her hands loose in her lap. Not detached, more like she had removed herself from the outcome to protect herself from another disappointment. I've been telling them for 8 months, she said. Her voice was even, controlled. Nobody finds anything wrong, but I'm in pain every day. Mason wasn't a doctor, wasn't a rehabilitation engineer or a biomechanical specialist or whatever the right word was for someone who solved this kind of problem. He was a guy who fixed engines in a county garage and raised his kid and paid his bills on time. Mostly. He had no business getting involved in this. He also had this thing, had always had it, where he couldn't make himself walk away from a sound that didn't fit. Can I get close to it? He asked. Avery looked at him steadily. Yes, D. He spent the first 10 minutes just watching. Not the chair. Her. The way she navigated the uneven surface of the lot. The slight shimmy when the right wheel hit the lip of a concrete expansion joint. The almost imperceptible way her body compensated. A tightening in her left shoulder. A very small lift of her chin. She wasn't complaining. She probably didn't even know she was doing it anymore. That was the thing about pain that had gone on long enough. You stopped reacting to it and started just absorbing it, and eventually the absorption became so automatic that other people stopped seeing it. He crouched down beside the chair when she stopped near the garage entrance. Up close, the engineering was genuinely impressive. Whoever had designed this thing had put serious thought into weight distribution, motor efficiency, the articulation of the footrest assembly. He could see why technicians who ran diagnostics on it kept coming back with clean results. On paper, this was a piece of very good equipment, but paper doesn't hear things. Mason tilted his head slightly. There it was, faint, almost disappearing under the ambient sounds of the lot, the distant highway, a crow complaining about something in the oak tree at the edge of the property, a sound from somewhere inside the right motor housing. Not a grinding, not anything so obvious. More like a very slight asymmetry in the rotation, a rhythm that was off by just enough to be wrong without being measurable. Has anyone opened the motor housings? He asked, still looking at the right rear wheel. Multiple times, Vanessa said from behind him. They check everything, all within specifications. I'm not asking if it's within specifications. I'm asking if anyone opened it and listened. Silence. He looked up. Vanessa was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Part skepticism, part something else. Avery was looking at him with a stillness that felt different than before, a different quality of attention. No, Avery said quietly. Nobody ever said that. Mom. He had a kid to pick up at 3:15. That was the thing about being a single parent. The day had anchor points that couldn't move. 8:47 a.m. School drop-off. 3:15 p.m. School pickup. Everything else arranged itself around those two fixed stars. It was the structure that had held him together in the first brutal year after Julie left, when he'd had to learn how to be everything at once, how to make lunches and check reading logs, and also somehow run a business, and also somehow not fall apart. Ethan was 8 now. Clever kid, serious about things other kids found stupid. He was currently passionate about bridge design and migratory birds, which made dinner conversation somewhat unpredictable. Mason kept waiting for the phase where Ethan decided his father was embarrassing. So far, it hadn't arrived. It was 9:45 a.m. He had time. Pull her in, he said, and stood up. I need a full workspace. But the garage had 2 bays. He cleared the second one, moved the Camry outside, swept up the worst of the floor debris, found his better floor lamp, and angled it toward the center of the space. Vanessa watched all of this from just inside the doorway with the patient intensity of someone reviewing a proposal they weren't sure they believed in. Avery positioned herself in the middle of the cleared space and waited. Is it okay if I put my hands on the frame? Mason asked her. I want to trace the vibration while you're moving. She nodded. Then, after a moment, you're the first person who's asked. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just crouched down and put his fingertips lightly on the right rear quarter of the frame. Go slow, he said. Just a few feet forward and back. She used the joystick. The chair moved, and under Mason's fingers he felt it. That slight irregularity, a ghost of it, transmitted through the frame. The right motor was producing torque output that was fractionally, almost impossibly different from the left. Not enough to flag on a standard diagnostic. Enough to create, over hours of use across months, a persistent lateral stress on Avery's posture. He kept his face neutral because he didn't want to get her hopes up before he was sure. "Stop there," he said. "Now, try turning right." She turned. He shifted his grip to the left side of the frame, feeling the distribution change. There. The chair was pulling, very slightly, into a turn that it was compensating for automatically, the software overriding the minor mechanical discrepancies so smoothly that diagnostics never flagged it. But the compensation created its own problem. The chair's body was working against itself in microseconds, a constant, almost invisible correction that the frame absorbed by transmitting the stress directly into the mounting points where Avery's support cushioning connected. Every time she sat in this chair, it was pushing against her, not violently, precisely, in exactly the same direction, 8 to 10 hours a day, for 8 months. Mason sat back on his heels. "I need to make some calls," he said. The call was to Denny Farrow, who had spent 20 years working aerospace electronics before a bad back sent him into semi-retirement outside of Marin Falls. They'd gone to school together, and Denny had a workbench in his barn that cost more than most hospitals. He was also someone who treated an interesting problem the way some people treat a crossword puzzle, compulsively, with complete focus. Mason explained what he'd found. There was a long pause on the other end. "That's subtle," Denny said. "I know. Standard diagnostics wouldn't catch that." "I know. How are you reading the torque differential? You don't have the equipment." "I felt it." Another pause. "You felt it." "In my hands, through the frame." Denny made a sound that was somewhere between respect and exasperation. "You know what the manufacturer is going to say if you touch that chair." "I know. So what are you asking me?" "I'm asking if I'm right." A long breath. "Describe the sound again." "The one you heard from the motor housing." Mason described it. He was good at describing sounds. It was a skill he developed out of necessity, explaining to customers what their car was doing before he could prove it. The way a seized caliper sounds different from a worn rotor, the specific frequency of a failing wheel bearing versus a loose heat shield. Denny listened without interrupting. Then, "Yeah," he said, "you're probably right. The motor's got a rotational irregularity that the control software is masking. The system's correcting it constantly, which means it's constantly creating counter-torque stress in the chassis. Everything stays within specs because the specs don't account for that interaction. Nobody wrote a spec for that. Can it be recalibrated? The motors need to be matched, and the software threshold for compensation needs to be reset to account for her specific postural load." Denny paused. "How much do you know about this woman? Her condition, her body mechanics?" "Not enough. Yet." Vanessa wasn't easily impressed. Mason had figured that out within about 4 minutes of meeting her, and it wasn't a criticism, it was just accurate. She was the kind of person who had dealt with enough incompetence wrapped in confidence that she'd developed a very finely tuned filter for bullshit. She applied it to everyone, which was probably smart given that she was apparently managing her sister's medical situation in addition to whatever she actually did professionally. He explained what he thought he'd found. He was careful with his words, not overselling it, not underselling it. Just what he'd observed, what it suggested, what he thought it meant. Vanessa listened. Her expression didn't change much, but something in her posture shifted slightly. "The engineer said the motors were matched," she said. "They're matched within manufacturer tolerance. That's not the same thing as matched to each other, and it's definitely not matched to her specific load distribution." He paused. "The chair was calibrated for the average person with her type of injury profile, not for her specifically. That's what fitting is supposed to do. A fitting session is usually an hour, sometimes 2. They make adjustments, they check comfort, they do a test drive. They're not running the chair for 8 hours and checking what it does to the frame stress over time." He stopped himself. He wasn't trying to indict anyone. He genuinely didn't think anyone had been careless on purpose. It's a gap in how these things get evaluated. The diagnostic tools look for malfunction. This isn't malfunctioning. It's just subtly wrong for this particular person. Another silence. Avery had been quiet through all of this, which Mason was beginning to understand was a choice she made when she was deciding whether to trust someone. She wasn't passive. She was evaluating. "What would you need?" she asked. "Time? Tonight. My contact, who knows the electronics side of this. And your medical records, your physiatrist's notes on your posture and how the injury affects your load-bearing patterns. He paused. If you have them. Avery looked at him. I have a 2-inch binder. Basen. She did. It was in a canvas tote bag that Vanessa retrieved from the SUV, and it was exactly what she'd said. A substantial document, tabbed and organized with the meticulous care of someone who had learned that if you wanted anything to actually happen, you had to become your own advocate and your own archivist simultaneously. Mason sat at his work table with the binder while Avery stayed in the garage, and he read. Not skimmed, read. He'd never read a medical file with this much attention in his life, and he was aware that he understood maybe 60% of the terminology, but the parts he understood were enough. She'd been injured 4 years ago. The injury was to her spinal cord at T10, thoracic, meaning her upper body had significant function and strength. The notes from her physical therapist were detailed about her compensatory patterns, the way she engaged her core and her shoulder girdle differently on each side because of a pre-existing asymmetry that had been present before the injury and was now amplified by it. Her left side was structurally dominant. It bore more load. When she was sitting for long periods, the pressure distribution skewed left, which in a properly calibrated chair would be compensated for by the support system. In her current chair, with the right motor producing subtly less torque than the left, the chair was consistently nudging her right, which meant her body was constantly fighting to maintain center. 8 to 10 hours a day. 8 months. He sat with that for a moment. Then he turned to the back of the binder where there were loose pages, some printed, some handwritten, that hadn't been formally tabbed. He was looking for the timeline of reports she'd made, trying to understand when the pain had started relative to when the chair was delivered. The last loose page wasn't a medical record. It was smaller, folded twice, written on notepaper, the handwriting small and precise but with a pressure to it that suggested it had been written with some urgency. He almost set it aside. Then he unfolded it and read. I've started hiding this note because I don't know who to give it to anymore. Every person I tell says the chair is fine. I've stopped arguing because arguing hasn't helped, and I'm tired. But I want someone to know that I'm not imagining this. I know my body. I've known it through everything it's been through, and I know when something is wrong. The pain is in my left shoulder and lower thoracic. It gets worse through the day. I wake up thinking maybe today will be different, and by noon I know it won't be. I've started staying home more because being out means being in the chair longer, and I can't explain to people why I've gone quiet without going through the whole thing again. If you're reading this, whoever you are, please don't tell me it's within specifications. I don't care what the specifications say. I care that I can't do my job anymore. I care that I had a life, and I'm losing pieces of it for reasons that no one will acknowledge. I just need someone to believe me. Mason read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along the original creases and set it on the table. He sat there for a long moment in the quiet of his garage, the distant sound of traffic on the county road, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. He thought about what it would feel like to spend 8 months telling people something was wrong and having each one of them smile patiently and show you a graph. He stood up, went to the garage bay where Avery was waiting. I found a note, he said, in the back of the binder, folded paper, small handwriting. Something crossed her face. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of bracing. I wrote that about 3 months ago, she said. I didn't know where to put it. It's clear, he said, what you wrote. She looked at him steadily. Did you read all of it? Yes. And? Mason pulled the stool out from under the workbench and sat down so they were closer to eye level. I think I know what's wrong with the chair, he said, and I think I can fix it, but I want to be straight with you about a few things first. She waited. I'm not a certified mobility equipment technician. I'm not licensed for this kind of modification. If I work on this chair tonight and something goes wrong, or if the manufacturer finds out that modifications were made, there could be problems. For you, for your equipment warranty, for me professionally. He paused. I need you to understand that before you decide anything. Avery was quiet for a moment. Are you going to do it anyway? That depends on you. Why? Because it's your chair. It's your body. And after 8 months of everyone making decisions about it without actually asking you what you're experiencing, I'm not about to do the same thing. The silence stretched. Somewhere outside, a car pulled in and then seemed to think better of it and pulled out again. The crow in the oak tree was still at it. My sister is going to fight you on this, Avery said. Probably. She's very protective. I noticed. She's been running interference for me since the accident, calling manufacturers, sitting in on appointments, doing all the things you have to do when she stopped, started again. When you're someone people look past. Mason didn't say anything. There wasn't a response to that wasn't either too small or too large. Do you actually think you can fix it? Avery asked. I think so. I have someone who knows the software side. Between us, yeah, I think we can. She nodded. Just once. Then do it, Yum. He called Denny back at 6. Ethan was at the kitchen table doing homework, a worksheet about multiplication that he'd finished in about 4 minutes and replaced with a hand-drawn blueprint of a suspension bridge, because that was Ethan. Mason made 2 sandwiches, put one in front of his son without comment, and paced the kitchen while Denny walked him through what he'd need. You're going to need to pull the motor housings, Denny said. Both of them. I need to look at the torque output logs directly from the motor controllers. The onboard system stores them, but the interface isn't user-facing. You need to know how to access it. Walk me through it. Mason, this is a $240,000 piece of equipment. I know. If you break it, I know, Denny. A long pause. Can you bring the chair to me? No. The owner needs it back first thing tomorrow, and she's been without a working solution for 8 months. I'm not adding another delay to that. He heard Denny breathe out, the sound of someone making a decision they weren't entirely comfortable with. Fine. I'll come to you. Give me 2 hours. After he hung up, Ethan looked up from his bridge blueprint. Who was that? Denny Farrow. You've met him. The one with the barn full of stuff. That's him. Ethan considered this. What are you fixing? A wheelchair. His son's expression shifted into genuine interest. You know how to fix wheelchairs? I'm learning. Ethan was quiet for a moment, pencil tapping against the edge of his blueprint. Is the person who uses it sick? She has a spinal cord injury. Her wheelchair is supposed to help her, but something's wrong with it, and nobody figured out what. But you did? I think so. Ethan looked at him with the particular steadiness that sometimes caught Mason off guard. This kid who was 8 years old and had somehow developed the habit of looking at things directly, without the deflections that most adults spent years cultivating. Good, Ethan said simply, and went back to his bridge. Mason was back at the garage by 8:15. Avery and Vanessa were there. Vanessa had arranged for Avery to use a loaner chair from a local medical supply place while Mason worked, which was clearly uncomfortable and too narrow, and Avery said nothing about it, and Mason noticed her saying nothing about it. Vanessa had questions. He expected that and welcomed it. He walked her through everything again. The torque differential, the compensation masking, the cumulative stress on Avery's support points, the specific relationship between the chair's behavior and Avery's pre-existing asymmetry. He showed her the pages in the binder he'd marked. He did not tell her about the note. If you're wrong, Vanessa said, if you do this and it doesn't help, then she's back where she was, which is where she already is. The warranty, I'll document everything I do. If the manufacturer wants to argue about it, there will be a record showing that their chair was creating a chronic stress pattern in a specific patient because the software's compensation thresholds weren't calibrated for her actual load distribution. I'm happy to have that conversation with them. He paused. You might actually want that conversation with them. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who would look at the chair, say it was beyond their scope, and send us back to the manufacturer. I thought about it. What changed your mind? He thought about the note, the small, careful handwriting, the pressure of it. I just need someone to believe me. He thought about the way Avery had answered his questions. Economical, precise, like someone who'd learned to strip all requests down to what was absolutely necessary because anything extra got lost. Nothing changed my mind, he said. It was always going to be this. Denny arrived at 9 with a hard case that looked like it belonged to a camera crew or a bomb disposal unit and contained neither. He shook hands with Vanessa with the careful formality of a man who understood that this woman had the capacity to make his life difficult if things went wrong, and then he crouched beside the chair with a headlamp and made very soft sounds of technical interest. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I hear it." "You hear it?" Vanessa said. Denny looked up. "The rotational irregularity. In the right motor." He looked at Mason. "You were right about the source. Can you get into the controller logs?" "Already planning to." They worked. Mason's garage became something it had never quite been before. Not just a place where mechanical things got fixed, but a place where two people who cared more about the problem than about the liability worked through the night on something that actually mattered. Denny accessed the motor controller logs through an interface that required a proprietary cable he'd apparently built himself for a different project years ago. The data was there, months of operational logs showing, in plain numbers, exactly what Mason had felt through his hands. The right motor was running at 98.3% of the left motor's output, not within the flagged threshold for error, not anything a standard diagnostic would catch, but enough, applied consistently over time, to push the chair's center of mass fractionally and persistently to the right. And the software's compensation was working beautifully, technically, by making micro-corrections in the left motor's output to maintain straight-line travel. The chair went where it was pointed. The compensation just happened to put a constant lateral strain on the mounting points where Avery's left hip support was anchored. "It's not the chair that's broken," Denny said at one point, leaning back on his heels and looking at the ceiling. "The chair's doing exactly what it's designed to do." "So what's broken?" Mason asked. "The assumption that there's a standard patient." Denny picked up his coffee. "Whoever set the compensation thresholds built them around aggregate data. Most people in her injury profile, this correction is invisible and harmless. She's got a pre-existing asymmetry that pushes into that correction in a way nobody modeled for." They rebalanced the motors first. A physical adjustment that Denny performed with tools Mason didn't own and borrowed from the hard case, bringing the right motor's output to within a fraction of the left. Then Denny wrote a custom compensation profile that accounted for Avery's specific left-dominant load pattern, reducing the overcorrection and redistributing the stress away from her hip mounting points. It took until 12:40 in the morning. When they were finished, Mason rolled the chair back and forth himself, back and forth across the garage floor, listening. The sound was gone. The asymmetry he'd felt in his hands was gone. He stood there in the quiet of his garage at 12:40 a.m., with Denny packing up his case and Vanessa sitting on a folding chair near the door drinking cold coffee, and he thought about how this might all be wrong, how he might have done something sophisticated and elaborate and wrong. And Avery would sit in this chair tomorrow morning and still be in pain, and he'd have to look at her and have no more answers than the dozen specialists before him. He thought about Ethan's voice. Good. He turned off the overhead lights and left just the floor lamp on, and he sat on the creeper with his back against the wall and waited for morning. At 6:15, he heard a car in the lot. He was awake, had been dozing in and out on the creeper, which was exactly as comfortable as it sounded, which was not at all. He stood up, joints protesting, and went to the bay door. Vanessa's SUV, the ramp coming down. Avery navigated from the loaner chair to the modified chair herself. She insisted on that, and Vanessa stood close but didn't interfere. It took a minute. When Avery settled into the seat, Mason watched her face. Not her expression, her body. The small automatic adjustments, the shoulder tightening, the chin lift, the almost invisible bracing, that he'd been watching since yesterday morning. They didn't come. Avery sat still for a moment, just still. Then she used the joystick and moved forward, slowly, across the garage floor. Turned right, turned left, moved back. Stopped. The garage was very quiet. Mason realized he was holding his breath. Avery looked up at him. Her face was doing something complicated. Not quite disbelief, not quite relief, but something in between that didn't have a clean name. "It doesn't hurt," she said. She said it the way people say things they've stopped letting themselves want, because wanting them had stopped feeling safe. "It doesn't hurt," she said again, quieter, and this time it sounded different, like she was letting herself believe it. Mason let out the breath. He looked away, at the wall, at nothing in particular, and gave her a moment that wasn't his. The morning after is always the hardest part to explain. Not because nothing happened. Everything happened. Avery had sat in the chair and the pain wasn't there, and something that had been wound tight inside her for 8 months had loosened, just slightly, in a way she hadn't let herself anticipate because anticipating it had stopped feeling safe a long time ago. All of that was real. All of that had happened. But the morning after a thing like that, you wake up not entirely sure it was real. You wake up with the muscle memory of disappointment already running, that automatic low-grade brace against the day, and you have to consciously talk yourself back into believing the thing that happened actually happened. Avery woke at 5:40. Her apartment was quiet, the city outside still in that particular gray-blue phase before the sun makes a commitment. She lay there for a moment, remembering. Then she transferred into the chair. She held very still. No pull. No that familiar drag toward the right that her body had learned to fight without her even knowing it was fighting. The chair just held her, evenly, the way it was supposed to. She let herself breathe. She didn't call Vanessa. It was too early, and also she needed to sit with this herself for a little while before her sister's energy came into the room. Vanessa's love was real and total, and sometimes it filled every available space and left no air for Avery to feel things in her own time. Avery had learned this about her sister and chosen not to say it, because some things are true and also unnecessary to say. She made coffee. She did it slowly, without the half-conscious urgency that had started creeping into her mornings over the months, that background pressure to finish whatever she was doing before the pain ramped up enough to change the calculation. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the city that was beginning, incrementally, to become visible. She was thinking about Mason Reed. Not romantically. Not yet. There was too much else happening in her head for that kind of thought to organize itself. But she was thinking about him the way you think about someone who has done something so specific and unexpected that you don't quite have a file for them yet. He'd asked permission. That was the thing that kept coming back. Every person who had worked on her chair, on her case, on her body over the last 4 years, physiatrists, PTs, engineers, the parade of well-meaning specialists, had proceeded with a kind of professional authority that didn't leave much room for the actual question of what she wanted. It wasn't malice. She didn't think most of them were bad people, but there was a pattern to it, the way her autonomy got gently sidelined by expertise, and she'd adapted to it the way you adapt to chronic low-grade weather. You stop noticing it because noticing it too precisely just makes you tired, Mason had asked. That depends on you, and meant it. She thought about the note she'd written 3 months ago, folded and slipped into the back of her binder with nowhere to go. He'd read it and come out of the workroom and looked at her and said, "I think I know what's wrong with the chair. Not this must be hard for you, or I hear that you've been frustrated. Just the direct thing, the thing that meant he'd actually processed what she'd said and moved forward from it. She hadn't realized, until someone did it, how hungry she'd been for exactly that. Tickum. She called her office at 8. Her assistant, Renata, picked up on the first ring with the cheerful efficiency that Mason would probably find unnerving and that Avery had come to find genuinely comforting. "Good morning, Avery Sterling's office. It's me." "Oh, good morning. You're up early. Should I—" "I'm coming in," Avery said. A pause, a short one. Renata had been with her for 3 years and had learned to navigate the particular calibration of Avery's work schedule post-injury. When she said she was coming in, sometimes she meant she was coming in and would be at full capacity, and sometimes she meant she was coming in and would need to leave by 2, and the difference mattered. "How are you feeling?" Renata asked. It was a code question, and they both knew it. "Better than yesterday," Avery said. "Actually better." "Oh," a different quality of pause. I'm glad. I'll be there by 9. Can you move the Caldwell call to 11? Already done. They called this morning to reschedule anyway. A beat. There's something you should know before you come in. Avery's hand tightened slightly around the mug. Tell me. Marcus Holt is going to be there. He arrived late yesterday, and Vanessa said you knew he was coming, but I know. She didn't know. She had forgotten. Or maybe Vanessa had mentioned it and she hadn't registered it because yesterday had been consuming all available bandwidth. It's fine, thank you. She set the phone down and looked at the city out the window for a moment longer. Marcus Holt was the majority stakeholder in Avery's company. Or more precisely, he'd been a majority stakeholder before a series of events that had been proceeding slowly and quietly for 6 months in the background of everything else. His presence at the office wasn't a surprise in the way that genuinely unexpected things are surprises. It was more the kind of thing you know is coming and put in a drawer until you have enough room in your life to deal with it, and then it arrives before you have enough room. She finished her coffee, got her bag, went to work. Vanessa called while Avery was in the elevator. You're going in. Good morning to you too. I saw your car leave on the building camera. Vanessa had access to the building security feed because Vanessa had access to most things that could conceivably be used to monitor Avery's well-being, and Avery had long since decided this was a fight not worth having. How does it feel? The chair? Good, Avery said. Still good. Still. The word carried the weight of everything Vanessa wasn't saying, 8 months of the opposite answer condensed into a single syllable. Still, Avery confirmed. A silence. Then, I want to go back to the garage. I want to talk to him. Mason. Mason Reed, yes. I want to understand. I want to know how to make sure this holds. What to look for if something changes. I want to have a real conversation with him about the chair. Avery considered this. That's fair? Also, I want to... Vanessa stopped. Started again with unusual care. I want to say thank you, properly. He'd probably just tell you it was nothing. Then I'll tell him it wasn't. Another pause. Will you come with me? Maybe this afternoon. I have Marcus this morning. The quality of Vanessa's silence changed. Do you want me there for that? No. Avery said it without hesitation. I'm fine. Avery. Vanessa. She kept her voice level. I'm fine. I'll call you after. The elevator opened. She crossed the lobby. Marcus Holt was 61 years old and had the smooth, unhurried presence of a man who had never been in a room where he wasn't the most important person, or if he had, he'd simply behaved as though he was until the room adjusted. He was at the conference table with 2 of his people when Avery came in, and he stood when she entered, which she'd always found interesting because it was the kind of gesture that could mean 2 completely different things depending on context. Avery, he smiled. You look well. Marcus. She settled at the head of the table, which was her table, and her office, and she had built this company from a concept and a shared workspace rental, and she was not going to perform uncertainty about that in front of him just because the last year had been difficult. I wasn't expecting you until Thursday. I moved things around. He said it lightly, the way people say things they've decided to make your problem to question. I wanted to check in. There's been concern from the board, from some of the investors, about the Meridian contract, the delays. The Meridian contract is in the final review stage. We've discussed this. We discussed it in June. He folded his hands on the table. His manner was perfectly cordial and had the specific quality of a door slowly closing. It's October, Avery. The timeline has slipped 3 times. There are questions about capacity. Avery looked at him steadily. She had been having this conversation in various forms for 6 months, and she knew exactly what questions about capacity meant. It meant, we're questioning whether you can still run this company given everything that has happened to you. It was never said directly. It was always the Meridian contract, the Q3 numbers, the board's concerns. Always proximate things, never the actual thing. The delays on Meridian are documented, she said. I can walk you through every one of them. 2 were on their end. 1 was a regulatory change that hit the entire sector, and 1 was a decision I made to restructure the deliverable because the original spec had a gap that would have cost us 6 times more to fix post-launch. She paused. I'm happy to have that conversation in detail if you want it. Marcus tilted his head slightly. That's not necessary. I think it is, she said, because when you say questions about capacity, I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. Are we talking about the meridian delays specifically, or are we talking about something else? The room was quiet. One of his associates found the surface of the table very interesting. Marcus looked at her for a moment, then he leaned back in his chair. You've been absent a great deal this year. I've been managing a medical situation. Of course. And nobody questions You're questioning it right now, Avery said, calmly, without heat. That's what this meeting is. He didn't flinch exactly, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. She had learned, over years of building this company and sitting in rooms with men like Marcus Holt, that the most unsettling thing you could do was name the actual thing quietly and then say nothing further. Leave it there on the table for everyone to look at. I'd like the full Meridian review documentation on my desk by Monday, Marcus said eventually. You'll have it by Friday. He nodded, stood. The meeting was apparently over. As he moved toward the door, he paused. The pause that Avery had learned to wait for, because there was always a pause, always a parting thought that was actually the thought he'd come to deliver. I'm glad you're feeling better, he said. I mean that. She held his gaze. Thank you, Marcus. After he left, she sat alone in the conference room for a minute. Not recovering, she wasn't going to think of it as recovering, just sitting with the facts of the situation. Marcus was circling. He'd been circling for months, and the months of her health struggle had given him material to work with, not because he was necessarily predatory, but because he was practical, and practical people seize the conditions in front of them. She wasn't finished. She'd been so consumed with the physical reality of the last 8 months, the pain, the appointments, the exhausting loop of not being believed, that she'd let some things drift that she couldn't afford to let drift. That was over now. The chair was right. Her body wasn't fighting itself every hour of the day. She had room in her head again. She pulled out her phone and called Renata. Get me Caldwell's actual decision-maker on the line, not the project manager, the CFO, and pull everything on Marcus's share position for the last 18 months. I want to look at the movement. Yeah. She went to the garage at 3 o'clock. Vanessa was already there when Avery arrived. She'd apparently shown up around noon, which, in retrospect, was very Vanessa. Mason was in the middle of something under a truck when they arrived, and he came out from under it with the same unhurried manner he'd had yesterday morning, like time was something he related to differently than most people. He nodded at Avery first. How is it? Good, she said. Same as this morning. No pain. Something in his face relaxed slightly. Not relief exactly, but the absence of attention she hadn't noticed he was carrying. Good, he said. Vanessa stepped forward with the purposefulness of someone who'd been rehearsing. I want to thank you, properly. What you did, working through the night, bringing in your colleague, the modifications, that was beyond anything we had any right to expect from you. Mason looked mildly uncomfortable. I did what made sense. A lot of people said that. None of them did what you did. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and didn't seem to know where to put that statement, so he just let it sit there. I'm glad it worked. There was a real chance I was wrong. Were you worried? He glanced away. A little, yeah. What would you have done if it hadn't worked? Vanessa asked. Kept looking. He said it simply, without performance. There was something wrong. I was sure of that part. Avery had been watching him during this exchange with the same kind of evaluating attention she'd given him yesterday. He was not a man who was comfortable with gratitude directed at him. That was clear. But it wasn't false modesty, the kind that fishes for the compliment to be repeated. He genuinely seemed to have put the whole thing in a category of problems you solve rather than remarkable things you did. Can I ask you something? She said. He looked at her. Sure. The note, in my binder. She paused. She hadn't planned to ask about it directly, but now that she was here, it seemed like the thing that mattered most. Did it change what you decided to do? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, not reaching for the comfortable answer. No, he said. I already knew what I was going to do when I found it, but, He stopped. It changed how I understood what was at stake. For you, there's a difference. She nodded slowly. 8 months is a long time, he said. To keep saying something's wrong and have nobody take it seriously. People took it seriously. They were very professional about it. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It's not. Vanessa had gone quiet beside her, which was notable. Avery glanced at her sister and found an expression she didn't see often. Vanessa looking at something she hadn't known was there. A sound from the back of the garage, a door opening, small footsteps, and then a boy appeared around the corner of a metal shelving unit. 8 years old, maybe, backpack still on, with the particular look of a kid who had just gotten out of school and had thoughts about it. Dad, Mrs. Patterson gave me a wrong grade on my… He stopped. Took in the presence of two unfamiliar women, recalibrated with the quick social processing of a kid who spent a lot of time with adults. Sorry, I didn't know you had people. Ethan, Mason said, these are the women from yesterday. Ms. Sterling, he gestured to Avery, and her sister. Ethan looked at Avery, then at the chair. His expression was openly curious in the way kids are before they learn to perform discretion. You're the one with the wheelchair, he said. Ethan, Mason started. I am, Avery said. Is it fixed? Dad said he was going to try to fix it. He did, she said. It works now. Ethan absorbed this, nodded once, with what appeared to be genuine satisfaction. Good. Then, apparently deciding that covered it, he turned back to his father. Can I tell you about the grade now? Despite everything, despite Marcus Holt and the board and 8 months of accumulated exhaustion, Avery felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't expected to loosen. She looked at this kid who had simply taken his father's work at face value. Dad said he was going to fix it. Is it fixed? Good. And it was so uncomplicated that it almost hurt. Mason gave her a slightly apologetic look, which she answered with a small shake of her head. Don't apologize. He turned his attention to Ethan. What grade? She gave me a B+ on my bridge report, but I had the right tensile load calculations. I did the math 3 times. Did you show your work? Most of it. Most of it, Mason repeated. The main stuff. The setup was obvious, so I didn't write it all out. Obvious to who? Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, made the face of someone encountering an argument they don't have a clean answer to. To me, he said, with somewhat less confidence. To your teacher? A pause. I'll write out the setup, Ethan said. That's what I'd do. Ethan pulled his backpack off and started toward the small office at the back of the garage that apparently served as his after-school headquarters. He stopped once, turned back to look at Avery. I'm glad it doesn't hurt anymore, he said, with complete directness, and then went through the door. The garage was quiet. He's remarkable, Vanessa said, and meant it. Mason looked faintly embarrassed. He has opinions. The best ones do. Avery came back the next morning. She told herself it was about the chair. There were questions, follow-up things she wanted to understand, the long-term maintenance questions she should have asked the day before. That was true. It was also not the whole truth, but she was willing to let one truth stand in for a more complicated one while she figured out the more complicated one. Mason was alone in the garage when she arrived. It was early, before 8, and he was doing inventory on a parts order with the resigned concentration of someone who does not enjoy paperwork but understands it is a non-negotiable part of having a business. I have questions about the chair, she said, and pulled up next to the workbench. Yeah, he said. I figured you might. He set the inventory clipboard down without ceremony. What are you worried about? Not worried. I want to understand what you did so I can monitor it myself. If something starts to feel off, I want to know what to look for. He nodded. That was the right answer, clearly. She could tell he approved of the question the same way he'd approved of her directness before. He pulled a stool over to the workbench and sat, and she moved her chair so they were facing the same direction, looking at the workbench together. The motors are matched now, he said. That should hold for a while. But these motors have service hours. The manufacturer recommends inspection every 18 months. That's probably accurate. And the software calibration? Denny, my friend who handled the programming side, he wrote you a profile. It's stored in the chair's controller. If you ever have to do a factory reset for any reason, that profile is gone. You'd need to recreate it. He paused. I can document the parameters. You should have them. I'll need the technical specifications in writing. I'll get them from Denny. She looked at the workbench. At the tools arranged along the wall, not obsessively organized, but with the particular logic of someone who knows exactly where everything is because they've reached for it 1,000 times. You're good at this, she said. This is what I do. I don't mean the mechanical part. I mean the... She considered the right word. The listening part. He was quiet for a moment. My dad was a mechanic. He used to say that every car is trying to tell you what's wrong with it. You just have to stop talking long enough to hear it. He sounds like someone worth listening to. He was. A pause. He died about 6 years ago. I'm sorry. He shrugged, and it wasn't a dismissive shrug. It was the shrug of someone who has had 6 years to make a partial peace with something and knows the peace is only partial. He would have found this interesting, the chair. He liked problems that didn't look like what they were. Avery found herself looking at his hands. The particular usefulness of them, the calluses, the old cuts, the grease that doesn't entirely come out of the creases in your palms, no matter how well you wash. Working hands, the real kind, not the kind kept deliberately rough for effect. Can I tell you something that has nothing to do with the chair? She said. He looked at her. Sure. I went to work yesterday, after the garage. She organized what she wanted to say, which was something she always did. She was not a spontaneous speaker, she thought, before she talked, and she'd stopped being apologetic about that. I have a majority stakeholder who's been building a case that I can't run my company anymore. He's using the medical situation as not evidence exactly, implication, the kind of thing that's very hard to argue against directly because it's never said directly. Mason was quiet, listening. Being in pain every day for 8 months affects things, she continued. I made decisions that were slower than they should have been. I missed some things. I've been fighting for enough credibility to get through each appointment, each consultation, and it took energy that should have gone somewhere else. She paused. I'm telling you this because yesterday at work, I could think clearly for the first time in months, and the thing I thought about was that I've been fighting the wrong fight. What's the right fight? Building the case that I can still do this, not defensively, offensively, doing the work and making it visible. She looked at him. The pain was real. The effect it had was real. But I let it be a reason to pull back when I should have found another way to stay present. Mason turned his coffee cup in his hands. You're being hard on yourself. I'm being accurate. Those aren't always different things, he said, but sometimes they are. She looked at him steadily. He held the look. He was, she was beginning to understand, someone who said what he meant and meant what he said and didn't perform either one. It was unusual enough to be notable. How do you do this? She asked. All of it. The business, the kid, She gestured at the garage. This. Not always well, he said, but you do it. I do it because the alternative is not doing it, and that doesn't work either. He set down the coffee cup. Ethan needs a life that functions, so I build one that functions. Some days it functions better than others. His mother? She hesitated. I'm sorry. That's not... It's okay. He didn't seem to find the question intrusive. She left when he was 4. It's been just us since then. Avery absorbed this. Does he miss her? He used to ask about her. Less now. Mason paused, choosing words. He's figured out that some questions don't have satisfying answers, and you can either be angry about that or just move forward. He mostly moves forward. He gets that from somewhere, she said. He looked at her with something complicated in his expression, not discomfort, not flattery, but something that was working out whether the thing being said was true and what to do with it if it was. Before he could answer, there was a sound in the lot. A car, pulling in too fast, stopping with a small scatter of gravel. Mason stood and went to look, and Avery followed. It was a company van, white, with the manufacturer's logo on the side in blue, the name that had been on Avery's chair for the 8 months she'd been reporting problems with it. 2 men got out. One was in a company uniform, the other was in a blazer, which meant he was not here to fix anything. Avessa recognized the blazer man from a conference call 6 months ago. Regional manager. His name was Patterson. Not Ethan's Patterson, a different one. And he had the particular expression of someone who had been sent to handle a situation and was deciding in real time how much authority he wanted to lead with. "Ms. Sterling," he said, "I'm glad you're here. We received a notification that unauthorized modifications may have been made to your mobility equipment." He looked at Mason. "Are you the individual who made those modifications?" Mason looked at him with the measured patience of someone who'd dealt with entitled people in his garage before and had a process for it. "I'm the owner," Mason said. "Mason Reed. You want to tell me who you are?" The situation had arrived faster than either of them expected. Avery looked at Mason. He met her eyes briefly, not asking permission, but acknowledging that this was her territory too. That whatever happened next, they were both in it. She turned to face the man from the manufacturer, straightened in the chair that no longer hurt, and felt something she hadn't felt in 8 months settle into place behind her sternum. "Come inside," she said. "Let's talk about what authorized actually means." Patterson, the man in the blazer, was named Glenn, which somehow fit him. Glenn Patterson, Regional Operations Manager for Nexar Mobility Systems, and he had a tablet under his arm and the careful posture of someone who was used to delivering unpleasant information in a way that kept the company legally insulated. Mason brought 2 folding chairs out from the office and set them near the workbench. He didn't offer coffee. He also didn't perform hostility, just moved through the practical motions of making a space for a conversation he hadn't asked for and wasn't afraid of. Avery positioned herself near the workbench. Vanessa, who had arrived 11 minutes after the Nexar van, Mason suspected she had some kind of alert set up, though he didn't ask, stood near the bay door with the stillness of someone who had decided to be a witness rather than a participant, for now. The timing of that decision, Mason understood, could change. Glenn set his tablet on the workbench without asking, which told Mason something about how he operated. "Our service monitoring system flagged a remote access event on your chair's controller 2 nights ago," Glenn said. He was addressing Avery, which was the right call, but his eyes kept moving to Mason in the way eyes move to the thing you're actually concerned about. The access was unauthorized. Someone interfaced directly with the motor control unit and made alterations to the operating software. "Recalibrations," Mason said. Glenn looked at him. "I'm sorry?" "You said alterations. They were recalibrations. There's a difference." "That's a distinction we'd dispute." Glenn's tone stayed even. He'd done this before, sat in rooms where people pushed back and held his ground, with the particular patience of someone backed by legal. Any modification to the chair's operating parameters without manufacturer authorization voids the equipment warranty and potentially creates liability exposure for... "The chair was hurting her," Mason said. The words came out flat and simple, and they landed in the space between everyone in the room and just sat there. Glenn paused. "Our engineers have conducted multiple diagnostic reviews of this unit. All systems were found to be operating within specifications," Avery said. "I know. I've heard that sentence approximately 40 times in the last 8 months. Glenn looked at her. His expression did something small, not softening exactly, but a very minor recalibration. He was not, Mason thought, a bad person. He was a person executing a function, and the function had its own logic that didn't leave much room for the 40 times sentence and what it meant to the woman who'd been on the receiving end of it. "Ms. Sterling," Glenn said, "I understand this has been a frustrating process." "Don't." Avery's voice was quiet but precise. "Don't characterize it. Just tell me what you're here to do." Another small pause. "We need to inspect the unit, document the modifications, and then we need to discuss next steps with respect to the warranty and the service agreement." "What does next steps mean specifically?" "Depending on what we find, we may need to restore the chair to its original factory configuration." The room went very quiet. Avery looked at him steadily. Mason watched her face and saw the thing happen that he'd learned to recognize over the last 2 days. That particular stillness, the one that was not calm, but was what she put on top of not calm when she needed to function. "If you restore this chair to its original configuration," she said carefully, "I will be in pain again, every day. The same pain I've been in for 8 months that your engineers told me wasn't caused by the chair. Glenn's jaw moved slightly. We understand that you've experienced discomfort. I have documented 8 months of pain reports. Avery's voice remained even. It was, Mason was realizing, one of her particular skills, the ability to be very serious while sounding very calm, which was not the same thing as being calm. I have physical therapy notes, physician notes, my own records. And I have the fact that within 12 hours of this man, she gestured toward Mason without looking at him, making modifications that your engineers said were unnecessary, my pain was gone, completely. That is data. It is not a coincidence. Glenn looked at his tablet, looked at Avery, looked at Mason. The access logs show the motor calibration was altered and a new software compensation profile was installed, he said, settling back into the procedural. It was, Mason understood, not stubbornness, but self-protection. When you don't know how to answer something, you return to the document in your hands. Our engineers will need to review those changes before we can assess whether they're— Bring your engineers, Avery said. I'll be here. So will the documentation of exactly what was done and why. She paused. And I'll have my legal team here as well. Glenn blinked, just once. Vanessa, from the doorway, said nothing, but Mason noticed her pull her phone from her pocket. After the Nexar van left, Glenn had agreed to return Thursday with the technical team, which gave everyone 48 hours. The garage was quiet in the specific way of a room that has just held more tension than it was built for. Mason went to the coffee maker in the back office. It was cheap and old and made coffee that was approximately accurate. He poured 2 cups without asking and brought one out to Avery and set it on the workbench beside her. She took it. Thank you. They're going to try to reset it, he said. It wasn't a question. They're going to try. She looked at the cup. Whether they succeed depends on whether my legal team can establish that the original configuration was causing documented harm. If we can do that, a restoration becomes complicated for them. You have that documentation. Most of it, she paused. The problem is that within specifications has been the answer every time. My own physicians deferred to the manufacturer's engineers. My medical records reflect a pattern of complaints, but also a pattern of the complaints being attributed to adjustment difficulties, to my injury profile, to everything except the chair. She looked up. I've been systematically not believed by the official record. Mason sat on the creeper. He was quiet for a moment. Denny kept everything, he said. The access logs, the original motor output data, the deviation pattern, the new calibration values. It's all documented. Would he testify to it? I'd have to ask him, but probably. Avery nodded. She was thinking he could see it happening, the same focused quality she'd had when she'd asked him about the maintenance parameters, that precision of a person who runs a company and knows how to assemble a case. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. If this becomes a legal situation, and it might, you could be named. Unauthorized modifications to medical equipment. I don't know exactly how that plays out, but I want you to understand that before we go further. Mason looked at his coffee. He'd thought about this, in the abstract, somewhere around 1 a.m. 2 nights ago. Not in detail. There hadn't been time for detail. But in the way you acknowledge a real thing and then decide to do the right thing anyway and deal with the rest when it arrives. I know, he said. You're not worried? I'm a little worried, but I was more worried about leaving you the way you were. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. That's a strange calculation for someone who met me 48 hours ago. Probably, he agreed. Does it bother you that I'm asking you about the risk? I could just— No. He shook his head. I'd rather know the whole thing. I don't do well with information being kept from me for my own good. He paused. Neither do you, I'd guess. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. No, she said. I really don't. Denny Farrow came to the garage that evening. He was 64 and moved with the deliberate care of someone managing a bad back, and he had the personal style of a man for whom aesthetics had become optional somewhere around 1987 and hadn't become relevant since. He came in, nodded at Avery in the chair, said, "You look better than I expected," with complete lack of social grace, and sat down at the workbench. "Tell me about Thursday," he said to Mason. Mason told him. Denny listened without interruption, which was one of his consistent qualities. "They're going to bring an engineer who's going to say the recalibration was dangerous and unauthorized," Denny said when Mason finished. "Probably. So we need someone who can say the opposite." Denny picked up his coffee. "Specifically, we need someone who can explain to a non-technical audience why the original configuration was creating a cumulative stress injury using the manufacturer's own data. Can you do that?" Denny made a face that meant yes, but I don't love it. "I can prepare something. I'll need the original diagnostic logs from before the recalibration, which I kept, and I'll need someone to help me translate it for people who don't know what a torque differential is." "I'll do that," Avery said. Denny looked at her. "You know motor control systems?" "I don't need to know the technical specifics. I need to understand the logic well enough to explain it to a board of directors or a judge." She paused. "I do that with financial instruments constantly. Show me the data." Denny looked at Mason with the expression of someone reevaluating a situation upward. "Okay," he said. They worked at the workbench for 2 hours. Denny pulled the logs on his laptop and walked Avery through what they showed. The deviation, the compensation pattern, the cumulative load calculation. She asked questions with the focus of someone who was building an argument in real time, identifying which parts were legible to a general audience and which needed translation. Mason mostly listened. He was not the right person for this phase of the problem, and he knew it. He could find the thing that was wrong. Denny could prove it technically. Avery could weaponize the proof. That was the shape of the situation, and he was fine with that. At one point, Ethan came out of the back office, stood at the workbench looking at Denny's laptop screen, and said, "Why is the right motor graph different from the left one?" And the three adults looked at each other before Denny said, "Because it's running slower." And Ethan said, "And that makes the chair push sideways." And Denny said, "Yeah, exactly." And Ethan nodded and went back to his homework as though he'd simply needed to verify a hypothesis. "Your kid," Avery said to Mason quietly, and left it there. "I know," he said. "Pashik was the..." Thursday morning arrived the way difficult mornings do. Ordinary on the outside, charged underneath. Mason had been in the garage since 6. Denny's documentation was printed and organized in a folder on the workbench. Avery arrived at 8:15 with a woman named Claire Sue, who was her legal counsel and had the calm, technical precision of someone who charged a great deal per hour and was worth it. Vanessa came at 8:30. Mason's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Paulette, who occasionally watched the garage when Mason needed coverage, had agreed to handle the morning without being told the full reason, because Paulette was perceptive and good. The Nexar team arrived at 9. Glenn Patterson in his blazer again, and this time with 2 engineers, real ones, young, carrying equipment cases, and a woman in a gray suit who introduced herself as Sandra Chu, Nexar's head of product liability. The appearance of Sandra Chu meant this had moved up the internal priority chain since Tuesday. Mason filed that away. They convened in the garage, which was not a conference room and didn't pretend to be. Mason didn't move things around to make it look more official. It was a garage with cleanish floors and good lighting, and it was what it was. Sandra Chu took the lead, which was expected. "We appreciate everyone's willingness to meet," she began, with the smooth preamble of corporate dispute management. "Our goal today is to understand what modifications were made, assess the current condition of the equipment, and discuss a path forward that protects all parties." "Our goal," Claire Sue said pleasantly, "is to establish that the chair, as originally configured, was causing documented physical harm to my client, and that the modifications made by Mr. Reed were not only reasonable but necessary." Sandra Chu looked at her. "I understand that's one perspective. It's the documented one. The engineers asked to examine the chair." Avery permitted it with the specific graciousness of someone who knows they have the stronger hand. While the engineers worked, running their diagnostic software, comparing the current calibration values to factory defaults, doing exactly what engineers do, Mason watched Sandra Chu's face and saw her reading Denny's documentation folder, which Claire had placed on the workbench with deliberate casualness. The engineers ran their tests for 40 minutes. Glenn hovered. Avery answered the engineer's questions about her experience directly and specifically. Dates, locations of pain, duration, changes in function, in the same economical way she approached everything. No embellishment, no emotion deployed for effect. Just precise information offered in a way that was very hard to argue with. At some point, one of the engineers, younger of the two, dark hair, the look of someone who was uncomfortable with what they were finding, showed something on his screen to the other engineer. A quiet exchange. Then both of them looked at the documentation folder on the workbench. Mason saw Glenn see this. During a pause, Mason came to stand next to Avery, not interposing himself, just present. She glanced at him sideways. He kept his eyes on the engineers. "You doing okay?" he said, low. "Yes." A pause. "How much trouble are you in?" "Depends how this goes. I won't let them come after your license." "You don't need to." "Mason." Her voice was quiet and direct. "I won't let them come after your license. You have my word." He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead at the engineers, jaw set, and he had no doubt she meant it. He also was not entirely comfortable with needing someone else's protection, which was a thing about himself he was aware of and wasn't sure what to do with. "Thank you," he said. The younger engineer cleared his throat. "Miss Chu." He held up his tablet. She came over. He walked her through something on the screen, keeping his voice low. Mason watched her face. She had good professional composure, but something in her expression shifted in the way expressions shift when a person receives information that complicates a position they arrived with. She looked up. At Avery. At Mason. At Denny's folder. "Can I ask," she said in a different tone than before, more direct, less managed, what data source was used to calculate the cumulative load stress in this documentation? Denny Farrow, who had been sitting on a stool in the corner, looking like he'd rather be in his barn, leaned forward. "The chair's own operational logs. The motor output data is stored in the controller. I accessed it through the service port. You have a background in aerospace electronics. 20 years. He paused. "The calculations aren't complicated. The pattern is in the manufacturer's own data. We didn't generate it. We just looked at it." Sandra Chu was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the folder, at the tablet in the engineer's hands, at Avery. Then she did something Mason hadn't expected. She sat down on one of the folding chairs. "Walk me through it," she said to Denny. "The whole thing." The walkthrough took an hour. Denny was a good explainer when he chose to be, systematic, without condescension, willing to stop and restate when the question on someone's face indicated they hadn't followed. Sandra Chu asked questions that were better than expected. The younger engineer started contributing, which Mason interpreted as a sign that he was more interested in the truth of the problem than in the corporate outcome of the meeting, and he made a small internal note of respect for that. At some point, Glenn Patterson sat down too. Mason stayed standing. He leaned against the workbench and watched the room and thought about what he'd expected this morning versus what was actually happening. He'd expected a harder fight, more legal posturing, more stonewalling, more defense of the original position. Instead, what was happening felt more like a room of people collectively processing information that was changing what they knew and adjusting, with varying degrees of speed and grace, to the new shape of the facts. Avery had been watching too. When Denny finished and the room was quiet, she spoke. "I'm not interested in litigation," she said. "I want to be clear about that. What I want is what I've always wanted. Equipment that doesn't hurt me, an acknowledgement that the pain I reported was real and had a cause." Sandra Chu looked at her. "The documentation does indicate—" She stopped, started again more carefully. "The data suggests that there was a configuration issue that our diagnostic protocols didn't identify. That's a significant finding." "It is. And I want to be honest with you. That's going to require us to review our diagnostic protocols and our patient-reported symptom escalation processes." She said it with the measured transparency of someone who knows they're making an admission but has decided the alternative is worse. Neither of those things happen fast enough in your case. I'm not going to argue with that. The room was quiet. Avery said nothing. She let the acknowledgement exist without rushing to fill it, which Mason was beginning to think was one of her most effective qualities. It was Vanessa who spoke from the doorway. Her voice was different than it had been in previous meetings, less armored. "My sister told 17 people over 8 months that something was wrong," she said. 17. And the answer was always the same. Do you have any idea what that does to a person? Not the pain, the not being believed? Sandra Chu looked at her, then at Avery. "No," she said, honestly. "I don't. I'm sorry." The apology was imperfect. It was also clearly real. And real imperfect apologies are rarer than people expect. Mason looked at Avery. Her face was doing the complicated thing again. The thing that wasn't quite one emotion but several, processing in parallel. 8 months of the word no hitting the word yes all at once, and nobody around her quite knowing what to do with the collision. She was steady. She was always steady. But Mason, who had been watching her for 3 days now with more attention than he'd given to most things in recent memory, noticed her right hand tighten very briefly on the armrest of the chair. Just once. Just for a second. Then she let it go. "I want the chair to stay as it is," she said. "I want Nexar to formally document that the modifications were clinically indicated based on your own equipment data, and I want a review process established so that when a patient reports persistent pain, there's a path for escalation that doesn't end at a diagnostic report that says within specifications." She paused. "Those are my terms. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for process." Sandra Chu looked at the table, at the tablet, at Glenn. Glenn, for the first time since he'd arrived, looked like he was somewhere other than inside a corporate procedure. "I'll need to take this back to our executive team," Sandra said. "Of course. Claire will be in contact." Avery looked at the younger engineer. "Thank you for being straight with us about what you found." The engineer looked slightly startled to be directly addressed. "Of course," he said, and then, with more quiet honesty than the situation probably required, "The data was pretty clear once we looked at it from this angle. I wish we'd looked from this angle sooner." Nobody had a response to that. The meeting ended without ceremony, and the Nexar van left, and the garage exhaled. Chesh. Mason found himself standing in the bay alone for a few minutes after Avery and Claire and Vanessa stepped outside to talk. He wasn't processing it dramatically. He was tired, mostly, the specific tiredness of the last 3 days catching up now that the adrenaline had a place to go. He went to the coffee maker and found it empty, and decided he'd fix that later and just leaned against the work table. Denny appeared at his shoulder. "Not bad. Sandra Chu was better than I expected." The engineer was the one who mattered. Kid couldn't sit on that data. Denny picked up his folder, which Claire had left behind. "What happens now?" "Legal stuff, probably, for a while." "They're not coming after you?" "I don't know yet." Denny was quiet. Then, "It was the right thing to do." "I know." "You're going to lose the Nexar certification application you put in last spring." Mason looked at the wall. He'd thought about this. The application to become a certified Nexar Mobility Equipment Service Center, which he'd filed in April, which would have been real new revenue, which he'd been quietly hopeful about. Gone now, almost certainly. "Yeah," he said. "You're not upset?" "I'm a little upset." He was. It wasn't nothing, the certification, the revenue, the time he'd spent on the application. It was a real loss. He let it be real for a moment. "But I'd do it again." Denny picked up his case. "I know you would," he said, not with admiration, but with the practical acknowledgement of someone who has known a person long enough to know what they are. "That's your whole problem, Mason." "Yeah," Mason said, "I know." Outside, through the open bay door, he could see Avery in conversation with Claire and Vanessa. The October light was different now than it had been on the morning she'd arrived, lower and longer. The particular gold of late afternoon in the middle of the month. She was talking with animation that he hadn't seen from her before, hands moving, leaning slightly forward in the chair with the specific energy of someone who has been conserving themselves for a long time and has just found it's okay to stop. Ethan came out of the office with his backpack and stopped beside Mason, following his gaze. "Is it over?" he asked. "This part of it? Is she okay?" "Yeah," Mason said. I think she's going to be. Ethan stood there for a moment. He was quiet in the way he got quiet when he was thinking about something seriously. Dad, he said, did you get in trouble for fixing her chair? Mason looked down at his son. A little bit. Ethan processed this with the steady seriousness he brought to things he considered important. But you'd do it again. Yeah. Even knowing you'd get in trouble? Yeah. Ethan looked back at Avery. Then, with the certainty of someone whose reasoning has resolved, okay, he said, and went back inside. Mason watched him go. Then he went to the bay door and looked at the afternoon and thought about what was next. The legal question still unresolved, the certification almost certainly gone, the Nexar situation somewhere in corporate deliberation, and found, to his own mild surprise, that the tallied weight of it didn't feel the way he'd expected it to feel. He'd done the right thing. He'd done it with full knowledge of the cost. And when he held those two facts together, they didn't cancel each other out. They just both stayed true, which was sometimes all you got, and sometimes was enough. The Nexar certification application was officially withdrawn 11 days after the garage meeting. Mason got the letter on a Tuesday. It was brief and professional and said nothing about why, which was how these things worked. They didn't tell you the reason, they just removed the possibility and left you to draw your own conclusions. He read it once, folded it, put it in the filing cabinet under N, and went back to the truck he'd been working on. He told Denny that evening by text. Denny replied, "Figured. Sorry." Which was the right response, so not too much, not nothing. He didn't tell Avery. She had enough moving parts in her own situation, and this was his to carry. He was aware this was possibly a slightly stubborn way to handle it, but he was also aware he wasn't ready to change that about himself yet. The 2 weeks following the Thursday meeting had a particular quality. A lot happening at the legal and corporate level, most of which Mason was adjacent to rather than inside. Claire Sue's office communicated with Nexar's legal team. Documents moved. Denny's technical report became a formal exhibit. Avery's 8 months of medical records, which she had organized with the precision of someone who had learned that the system would not keep track of things for her, became the backbone of a formal complaint that was simultaneously being filed with the State Medical Device Oversight Board. Mason knew these things because Avery told him, and she told him because she had decided, with the same directness she applied to everything, that he was part of this and deserved to know its shape. She'd sent him a message one evening. "I keep you informed because you kept me informed. That seems right." He'd read it and thought about it for a moment and written back, "Appreciated," which was insufficient but honest. She came to the garage every few days, not always with a stated reason. Sometimes it was the chair maintenance questions, sometimes it was updates on the legal situation, and once it was just that she was in the area and stopped. He didn't analyze this too carefully. He was wary of the particular narrative pressure of a situation like this. A man who helps a woman in a significant way, and then the story wants them to fall in love because that's the shape stories have when they have this kind of gravity. Real things didn't always cooperate with that shape, and he wasn't going to push the thing into a form it might not want to take, but she came back. And when she was there, the garage felt different than it did otherwise. More occupied somehow, like the space had more purpose in it. He noticed this and filed it under things to think about later. The Nexar response came in writing on a Friday, 3 weeks after the Thursday meeting. Claire Sue sent it to Avery and copied Mason, which he suspected was at Avery's instruction. It was 4 pages. He read it standing at the workbench. The important parts were, Nexar would not pursue action against Mason for the modifications. They were formally acknowledging, in language that had clearly been negotiated carefully, that the chair's factory calibration had created a configuration incompatible with Avery's specific physical profile. They were committing to a review of their patient-reported symptom escalation procedures, and they were, in a separate but related document, establishing a clinical consultation protocol that required a human review, not just a diagnostic algorithm, when a user reported persistent pain for longer than 60 days. Mason set the papers down. He stood there for a moment. 60 days was still too long, in his opinion. But it was 60 days less than 8 months, and it had a name and a process attached to it, which was more than had existed last month. He called Denny. "They're not coming after me," he said. Denny exhaled. Good. They acknowledged the configuration issue. In those words? In negotiated words that mean that. Close enough. A pause. How do you feel? Mason thought about it. He was standing in his garage on a Friday afternoon, truck on the lift, coffee going cold on the workbench, certification gone, and a 4-page letter on the table that said he wasn't legally exposed for doing the right thing. He felt, mostly, tired. And also something else. A specific quietness that comes when you've been braced for impact for 3 weeks, and the impact arrived smaller than you feared. Okay, he said. I feel okay. You should feel more than okay. I know. I'm working on it. But Avery read the same letter in her office. She read it twice. Not because she didn't understand it the first time, but because she had learned not to trust good news until she'd looked at it from multiple angles. Then she set it on her desk and looked at the city outside her window for a while. Her assistant Renata knocked and came in with a coffee, which Avery accepted, and then Renata lingered in the way she did when she had something to say that she wasn't sure was her place to say. I saw the Nexar letter, Renata said, on the system. And? It's a good outcome. Renata set the coffee carefully on the desk. It's a really good outcome. It is. Are you happy about it? Avery considered the question. It was the right question and also not entirely simple. Yes, she said. I think I'm still figuring out the shape of happy. It's been a while. Renata nodded. She understood this, or at least she understood enough of it to not push. She was, Avery thought, one of the better humans in her immediate orbit, not because she was easy or accommodating, but because she paid attention without making the attention its own performance. There's something else, Renata said. Marcus Holt's office called this morning. He wants to meet. Avery looked at her coffee. When? He said any time this week. His people said it wasn't urgent. A pause. Which probably means it is. It always does. Avery thought about Marcus. The meeting 3 weeks ago. The careful, cordial circling. The way he'd paused at the door to say, I'm glad you're feeling better, as though he genuinely meant it, while also meaning everything else. Set it for Wednesday. Here, not his office. Done. Renata moved toward the door, then stopped. Can I ask you something? Personal? You can try. The mechanic, Mason Reed. She said it neutrally, factually, like she was identifying a document. He's been to the office twice this week, with updates from his legal team. He has. People have noticed. People notice everything, Avery said. What's your question? Renata looked at her with the directness of someone who has decided to go all the way in. Is there something there? Between you? Avery was quiet for a moment. It was the question she had been having with herself for the past week and a half, at odd hours. Early in the morning with the coffee, late at night when the apartment was quiet and the city hummed outside. She had organized and reorganized the facts of it. The way she organized everything, trying to find the clean answer. She had not found one. I don't know, she said. It was the honest answer. Renata nodded, apparently satisfied with the honesty, if not the resolution. He seems like a good person, she said. He is, Avery said with more certainty than she'd expected to have. He genuinely is, Sarhad. The Wednesday meeting with Marcus happened at 10 in the morning. He came alone this time, which was notable. No associates, no support staff, just Marcus in a charcoal suit, coming through the door of her conference room and sitting across the table with the ease of someone who was about to say something he'd rehearsed and then decided not to. You handled the Nexar situation well, he said. Avery waited. This was not how the conversation was going to end. I heard about it from Sandra Chu, actually. She called me. He folded his hands on the table. She said, and I'm quoting here, that your documentation of the case was more thorough than anything their internal team had put together, and that you negotiated the outcome without litigation. Sandra Chu called you, Avery said. Why? Marcus looked at her with the look of someone deciding how honest to be. Because she knew I was on your board, and she wanted to say that the experience with you had been, he chose the word carefully, clarifying. Clarifying for her or for you? Both. he said simply. Avery said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that there were conversations where silence was the most powerful available response. I've been watching you manage this medical situation, Marcus said. Watching is the wrong word. I've been aware of it. The appointments, the disruptions, the difficulties. And I have to be honest with you, Avery. There were moments when I had doubts about your capacity to sustain this company through it. I know. I'm telling you this directly because you deserve directness. I appreciate that. What I didn't account for, he stopped, started again. What I didn't understand is that the difficulties you were dealing with had a fixable cause that nobody had identified for 8 months, and that the way you handled it, when you found someone who identified it, was, he paused. It was the way you handle everything, completely and without drama. Avery looked at him steadily. Where is this going, Marcus? He spread his hand slightly. I'm withdrawing my concerns from the board conversation. The Meridian review is solid. I've read the documentation, and the questions I was raising about capacity were based on circumstances that have changed. He paused. I owe you an acknowledgement of that. It was, Avery thought, a genuinely good thing to say. It was also a thing she had spent months fighting her way toward being allowed to hear. She sat with both of those facts simultaneously. Thank you, she said. I'm not usually wrong about people, Marcus said. When I am, I try to say so. That's a good quality. I thought so. He smiled. The real one, not the meeting smile. The Meridian review. Let's talk through it. I have thoughts. They talked for 90 minutes. About Meridian, about Q4, about a potential acquisition Marcus had been considering that he wanted Avery's perspective on. It was the most functional meeting they'd had in a year. Something had shifted in the room, not that Marcus had become an ally exactly, but that the circling had stopped. And what was underneath the circling was two people who were actually reasonably well suited to making strategic decisions together when they weren't performing a power contest. After he left, Avery sat at the conference table for a while. The city was loud outside. The afternoon was going. She picked up her phone and called Mason. So he answered on the third ring, slightly out of breath. She could hear the garage sounds behind him. Sorry, he said, wiping my hands. I had a meeting this morning, she said, with the board member I told you about, Marcus. Yeah? How'd it go? He backed off. She paused. He apologized. In his way. A beat of quiet. That's good. It is. I've been sitting here trying to feel good about it, and mostly feeling, she searched for the word, flat, which doesn't make sense because it's exactly what I wanted. It makes sense, Mason said. She heard him settle. The sound of a stool, maybe. Sometimes when things work out the way you fought for them to work out, there's not as much left to feel as you expected, because you spent all the feeling fighting. She sat with that for a moment. It was accurate, accurately named. How are you? She asked. Good. Working? The certification letter. A pause. She'd known about it for a week. Denny had mentioned it in passing when they'd spoken about the technical documentation, and she'd sat on the information, not sure what to do with it, aware that Mason hadn't told her himself. How do you know about that? He asked, not accusatory. Just asking. Denny. Another pause. It's fine. It's not nothing. No. But it's the thing I knew might happen, going in, so it's not a surprise. He was quiet for a moment. There are other certifications, and the garage is doing okay. Mason? Avery. I want to... She stopped. She was about to say something she hadn't entirely organized yet, which was unusual for her, and she decided to say it anyway. I want to do something about that. The certification, the lost revenue. You took a real loss because of this. You don't owe me anything. I didn't say I owed you. I said I want to. She paused. There's a difference. A longer quiet. She could hear him breathing, the background of the garage. She had learned, in 3 weeks of knowing him, that his silences were not uncomfortable. He used them to think rather than to build tension, and once you understood that, they became easy to sit in. What are you thinking? He said. I don't know yet. Let me think. She paused. Can I come by this week? Yeah, he said. Come by. She came on Friday. The garage was busy. A car waiting on the lift, another in the lot, Paulette dropping off a casserole dish that Mason accepted with the expression of a man who had learned not to fight certain kinds of help. Ethan was already there, having finished school at noon for some county reason, and was at the workbench with a library book about structural engineering and a look of complete absorption. Avery came in and Ethan looked up. Hi, he said. Hi. Dad said you might come. He looked back at his book, then up again. Are you going to work on something or just talk? Ethan, Mason said from across the garage. I was just asking. Probably talk, Avery said. Okay. He seemed genuinely unbothered by this. The book's good if you want something to do while you talk. He held it up. Bridge engineering, design principles, and practice, which seemed like advanced reading for an 8-year-old and apparently was not. I'll keep that in mind, Avery said. She found Mason near the lift. He had the particular look of someone in the middle of something he was going to have to step out of, which she recognized. Don't stop working, she said. I'll be here. I'm not going to keep working while you're... Mason, I spend my days in rooms where people feel obligated to give me their full attention at the expense of whatever they were actually doing. I prefer it when people just do their work. She settled near the workbench, angled to see him without being in the way. I'll talk while you work. He looked at her. Okay, he said, and went back to the truck. She watched him for a moment. He moved through the work the way he moved through everything, without waste, without drama. There was something restful about watching someone who was good at a thing do that thing without performing the goodness. I've been thinking about something, she said. Tell me. You fixed a problem that 17 specialists couldn't fix, not because you have more credentials, but because you listened differently. She paused. I think there are a lot of people like me. People with complex equipment, complex medical profiles, persistent pain, and nowhere to go after the standard system has told them everything is fine. He kept working, but she could tell from the slight change in his posture that he was listening fully. There's a gap between what rehabilitation engineers do and what you did, she continued. They design for average users, they fit for average users, and then the people who aren't average, who have asymmetries or unusual injury profiles or equipment that interacts with their body in ways nobody modeled, they're just left in that gap. Mason lowered the wrench. What are you thinking? A center, she said. Specialized mobility consultation. People who need someone to look at their equipment and their body together, not just run the diagnostics, but actually evaluate the fit the way you evaluated mine. He turned to look at her. She kept her tone deliberate. Not excited, not selling, just laying it out the way she'd been turning it over in her mind. You'd need more than one person, he said. I know. You'd need Denny. You'd need physical therapists willing to collaborate, probably a biomechanical engineer. She paused. And you'd need funding. I want to fund it. He set the wrench on the edge of the truck. Avery, I'm serious. I know you're serious. That doesn't mean that it's the right thing? She looked at him steadily. Walk me through why it isn't. He was quiet. She let him be quiet. This was, she had learned, an important part of the process with him. He didn't dismiss things, but he needed to actually think through them before he responded. And if you pushed during the thinking, he'd pull back. I know how to fix engines, he said finally, and I figured out one chair. That's different from running a medical consultation center. You don't run it alone. You find the right people and you build the team. She paused. You're good at the thing that nobody else was doing. The listening, the observing, the willingness to believe the person who's in pain. That's the center of it. Everything else can be built around it. He looked at the truck, then at his hands, then at Avery. Where would it be? He said. And something in the quality of the question, the fact that it was logistical rather than resistant, told her that the door had opened. That's negotiable, she said. Somewhere with enough space, accessible. Not too far from where you are because Ethan's school shouldn't move. She paused. I've been looking at properties. You've been looking at properties, he repeated, with the expression of someone who has just learned the conversation was further along than they realized. I think about problems until they're solved, she said. That's how I work. I know, he said. There was a sound from the workbench. Ethan, without looking up from his book. She looked at one on Carpenter Road. I saw it on her tablet last time she was here. They both looked at him. What? He said. I have good peripheral vision. Mason looked at Avery. Avery looked at Mason. Carpenter Road is 12 minutes from the school, Ethan said, turning a page. Just so you know. Détente. It took another 2 weeks before the conversation had enough shape to be called a plan. Those 2 weeks had their own texture. The usual complications of real things, unlike the cleaner narrative of decisions made and immediately executed. Mason talked to Denny, who said he was too old and too retired to commit to a full-time role, and then spent 40 minutes discussing what the equipment layout would need to look like, which Denny would later claim was a separate conversation. Mason talked to a physical therapist named Greta Osei, who ran her own small practice 20 minutes away and had been quietly frustrated for years by the gap that Avery had named, the one between what her patients reported and what the equipment evaluations confirmed. She listened to Mason explain the idea over the phone, asked 4 specific questions, and said she needed to think about it. She called back the next morning with more questions. He took that as interest. Avery handled the financial architecture the way she handled everything in her professional life, with precise and thorough attention. She structured the funding as a foundation rather than a for-profit entity, which had its own advantages and complications that Claire Sue helped navigate. She was clear with Mason from the beginning. This was not charity. It was not payment for what he'd done for her, and she would not be treating it as either. It was an investment in a real gap she'd identified, with a person she believed could address it. I'm going to need you to sign things, she told him one afternoon. I've never signed this many things in my life. You're starting a nonprofit medical consultation center. There are forms. How many forms? A number that will surprise you. She said it without apology. Renata will help you through them. He looked at her. Your assistant is going to help me fill out my paperwork. She offered. I didn't ask her to. Avery paused. People tend to want to help with this. I've noticed that about it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the garage, October had finished its business, and November was doing what November does in this part of the state, settling gray and deliberate over everything, the trees stripped, the light coming in lower and more honest. He was standing in the bay door looking at the parking lot and thinking about a version of his life that had not been available to him 2 months ago. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. Why me? He turned to look at her. You could fund this with anyone. Find a certified specialist, someone with the right credentials on paper. Why build it around a mechanic from Marin County? She considered the question. He could tell she'd thought about it before. Because credentials don't fix the gap, she said. The people with the right credentials were the 17 who told me the chair was fine. The person who fixed it was someone who didn't have the credentials but had something else. The willingness to believe me, and the stubbornness to keep looking until he found what was wrong. She paused. I can fund credentials. I can hire them. What I can't manufacture is what you have. So I start there. He looked at her for a long moment. You're sure? He said. I'm sure. Even knowing I don't know what I'm doing half the time. Especially knowing that, she said. People who always know what they're doing tend to stop learning. He looked back out at the parking lot. The gray sky, the bare trees, the county road with its ordinary traffic. 11 years of this lot, this bay door, this view. He thought about his father in a garage not very different from this one, listening to an engine saying, every car is trying to tell you what's wrong with it. You just have to stop talking long enough to hear it. He turned back to Avery. Okay, he said. She didn't make a big thing of it. She just nodded, the way she nodded when a decision had been made and it was time to move to the next thing. I'll have the paperwork to you Monday, she said. He almost smiled. Of course you will. And outside, the November light went on doing what it does, settling over things without ceremony, marking the end of what was and the beginning of whatever came next. Not soft, not dramatic, just there, the way most important things are. Vanessa called Avery that evening. They talked for an hour. Not about the center or Nexar or Marcus Holt. Not about any of the things that had been the texture of their lives for months. They talked about things they hadn't talked about in a long time. Old things. Memories with no agenda. The peculiar, specific language that only exists between sisters. At one point, Vanessa said, "I didn't see how bad it had gotten for you." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that holds something important. "I know," Avery said. "I didn't tell you all of it." "You should have." "I should have." A pause. "We're both better at managing things than we are at asking for help." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "I'm working on it." "Me too," Avery said. Apparently, the center opened on a Thursday in late February. Not with a ribbon cutting or a press release. Avery had suggested both, and Mason had declined both, which had led to a negotiation that ended with a small gathering of about 30 people and a sign on the door that said Marin Mobility Consultation Center in plain letters that Ethan had helped pick the font for, because he had opinions about fonts, apparently, and those opinions were more considered than Mason had expected. The building on Carpenter Road was a converted medical office. Single-story, wide doorways, parking lot that had been resurfaced and properly graded before they moved in. Nothing glamorous. Functional, clean, with good lighting because Avery had insisted on the lighting and Mason had quickly understood why. There were 2 consultation rooms, a workshop space at the back that Denny had spent 3 weeks organizing with the specific intensity of someone setting up an operating theater, and a front area with seating that was comfortable and didn't treat the people sitting in it like they were waiting for something bad. Mason had argued for keeping the garage open. Avery hadn't fought him on it. She'd said from the beginning that the garage was his, the center was something they were building together, and those were 2 different things. So Reed's garage stayed open Tuesday through Saturday, and the center operated Monday, Wednesday, Friday, with Thursday as flex depending on what the schedule needed. It was a lot of hours. He was tired in a way he hadn't been before. A productive tired that felt different from the tired of just getting by. Greta Osei came on board as the PT collaborator, part-time at first, with an agreement that would expand as the caseload did. She was 52, direct, funny when she chose to be, and had an impressive low tolerance for the kind of institutional language that substitutes process for actual thinking. She and Denny had developed, within about 4 days of working together, the specific rapport of 2 people who argued constantly about technical details and agreed on everything that actually mattered. Mason found this both efficient and occasionally exhausting. The first client arrived on the center's first day, a 47-year-old man named Robert Chu, no relation to Sandra, who had been using a power chair for 3 years and had been reporting back pain for 18 months. His equipment had been evaluated twice, within specification. Mason recognized the phrase the way you recognize a word in a foreign language you're still learning, with a particular alertness. He spent 2 hours with Robert, not running diagnostics, talking first, asking about his day, his routine, how long he used the chair before the pain started, what activities he'd stopped doing when he'd last had a day without pain. Robert answered with the cautiousness of someone who had told this story before and been returned to sender. Mason listened with the attention he'd developed over 11 years of listening to engines. The specific skill of hearing not just what was said, but what was also true. Then he looked at the chair, then at Robert in the chair. Then he called Greta in. By end of day, they had a working hypothesis and a modification plan. Not the same solution as Avery's. The problem was different. The person was different. The chair was a different manufacturer with a different design philosophy. But the underlying shape of the issue was familiar. Equipment that was technically correct and functionally wrong for the specific human using it. Robert left the center at 4:30. Before he went, he stood in the doorway. He could walk short distances and looked back at Mason. "Nobody's asked me all those questions before," he said. "Somebody should have," Mason said. "Yeah." Robert looked at the floor briefly. "Yeah, they should have." He said it without bitterness, just as a fact that he decided to set down now that he didn't need to carry it anymore. After he left, Mason sat in the consultation room for a few minutes alone. He was thinking about the note Avery had written 3 months ago and hidden in the back of her binder. "I just need someone to believe me." He was thinking about what it costs a person to need that for 8 months and not get it. And he was thinking about Robert in the doorway, saying nobody's asked me all those questions before, and how those 2 things were made of the same material. He sat with that for a while. Then he went back to work. By April, they had seen 23 clients. 14 had left with modifications or recalibrations. 6 were in ongoing consultation. 3 had been referred to additional specialists, not dismissed, not handed off, but connected to the right people with full documentation of what the center had found. 2 of those referrals had already resulted in diagnoses that had been missed during previous care. Word traveled the way word travels when something works, quietly at first, then faster. A physical therapist in the next county referred a client. A neurologist who'd heard about the Nexar situation through Sandra Chu's professional network reached out to ask questions about the center's methodology. A disability advocacy organization in the state capital sent an email that Avery flagged and said needed a thoughtful response, which it got. The Nexar protocol change, the 60-day patient report threshold requiring human clinical review, went into effect in March. Mason read about it in a brief industry newsletter that Denny forwarded with no comment. He thought about Avery's 8 months divided by 60 days and didn't feel triumphant. He felt something quieter and harder to name. Not satisfaction exactly, but the specific feeling of a thing having been fixed that needed fixing, which is its own category separate from satisfaction. He called Avery that evening. "The Nexar protocol is live," he said. "I saw," she said. "How does it feel?" A pause. He'd learned to love her pauses by now, the way she took the question seriously instead of reflexively answering. "Like something that should have existed 4 years ago," she said. "And also like something I'm glad exists now. Both of those can be true at the same time." "I know. I'm getting better at holding 2 things simultaneously. A pause with a different quality." "How are you?" "Tired. Good tired, mostly." "The center?" "Yeah, and the garage. It's a lot." "You can hire someone for the garage." "I know." "Mason." "I know, Avery. I'm working on it." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. He had discovered that she had a dry humor that came out at specific angles. When she was comfortable, when she was tired, when the conversation was real enough that she'd stopped managing it. He liked it. He liked it probably more than he'd admitted to himself, though the conversation he'd been not having with himself about Avery Sterling was getting harder to avoid as the months went on. "How is Ethan?" she asked. "Good. He won the regional competition." "The bridge?" "The bridge. His span held the most weight in the junior division." He paused. "He was extremely calm about it, which somehow made it worse for my blood pressure." She laughed. The real one, not the almost laugh. "You were nervous and he wasn't. I was a wreck." He shook hands with the judge and said, "Thank you for the fair assessment," like he was 40 years old. "He's remarkable." "He's something," Mason said. "I'm not always sure what." "You are. You just don't say it." He was quiet for a moment. The garage was empty behind him. He'd stayed late to finish a repair, and he was now sitting on the creeper with his back against the wall, the same position he'd been in on the night he'd waited for Avery's chair to be finished, the night everything had started going in a different direction. The fluorescent lights were doing their thing. The November light that had marked the beginning of this was spring light now, gone in the hours he'd spent at the workbench. "Can I say something?" he said. "Yes?" "I've been—" He stopped, started again. He was not, as a general rule, a person who talked about interior things with ease, and he was aware that this was sometimes a limitation and sometimes a protection, and lately had started feeling more like the first one. "I've been trying to figure out what this is, between us, and I don't think I know yet, but I wanted to say that it matters to me, whatever it is. It matters." The quiet that followed was a long one. He waited in it. "It matters to me too," she said. "I wanted to say that clearly, so you know I mean it." "Okay." "Okay," she agreed. They stayed on the phone for a while after that, talking about nothing in particular. The center schedule, a book Ethan had apparently recommended to Avery with the authority of someone curating a reading list. The truck Mason was working on that had a problem he found genuinely interesting. The acquisition Marcus Holt had ended up not pursuing, and the one he had, Ordinary Things, said between people for whom ordinary things had started to feel like a form of trust. Look, Vanessa came to the center in May. Not as a visitor. She had a proposal. She'd been talking to the disability advocacy organization that had emailed in April, and to 2 others, and to a healthcare foundation that had been looking for clinical gap projects to fund. The conversation had grown from a thing Avery had mentioned casually into a thing Vanessa had quietly spent 2 months building a case for, which was very Vanessa. She walked into the consultation room with a folder. A real one. Physical. Which told Mason how serious this was because Vanessa was a woman of spreadsheets and digital documents, and the appearance of a paper folder meant she'd thought about the optics of the meeting. "I have funding," she said without preamble. 3 sources. Enough to double the staff, add 2 more consultation rooms, and fund a 12-month research study on equipment patient fit outcomes. She set the folder on the table. "I also have a partnership proposal from the state's Disability Services Office. They want to refer complex cases to the center officially." Mason looked at the folder. "That's a lot." "Yes." "It changes the scale of what we're doing." "Yes," Vanessa said again. "That's the idea." Greta came in from the back. She'd clearly been within earshot, which Mason had learned was simply how Greta operated, and sat down with the focus of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of problem to materialize. "What's the staffing model?" Greta asked. Vanessa opened the folder. They talked for 2 hours. Mason mostly listened and asked specific questions, which was his method in situations where he was the least informed person in the room. Find the edges of what you understand. Ask about what's on the other side. Vanessa answered with the precision of someone who had spent 2 months anticipating exactly these questions. At some point, Denny appeared with coffee and set it on the table and pulled up a chair without being invited, and nobody seemed to find this unusual. By the end of the 2 hours, the shape of it was visible. Not complete. There were details that would need months of additional work, legal structures, hiring processes, accreditation questions that were genuinely complicated. But the shape was there. Mason sat with it after Vanessa and Greta had gone to look at the space for the 2 additional rooms, leaving him at the consultation table with an empty coffee cup and the open folder. He thought about October, the black SUV in his lot, the way the ramp came down, the sound from the motor housing that nobody else had thought to listen for. He thought about his father's hands and the particular patience that had been his father's most consistent quality, the willingness to sit with a problem until it told you what it was, without forcing it, without deciding in advance what you'd find. He thought about Ethan saying good, simply, without needing the full context, because he trusted his father's judgment, and that trust had never been complicated. He thought about Avery's note, hidden in the back of a binder, folded twice, written with the pressure of someone who had run out of visible places to put the truth. The thing about being ignored, the real thing, the thing that the clinical language never quite captures, is that it doesn't just hurt, it unmakes you. Slowly. It takes the evidence of your own experience and keeps returning it marked insufficient until you begin to wonder if the evidence is real, if your body can be trusted, if what you know is actually true. 17 people had, collectively, been unmaking Avery Sterling. Not with cruelty, with good diagnostic tools and professional confidence and the honest belief that the numbers told the whole story. The numbers never tell the whole story. Mason had known this about engines his whole life. Somehow, it had taken until October for him to understand it applied to people too, or more precisely, to people in the machinery that supported them. He got up, put the folder on the desk, and went to find Vanessa. The research study launched in September. The lead researcher was a biomechanical engineer from the State University named Dr. Priya Mehta, who had spent her career studying equipment user interaction and had a publication list that Denny had reviewed and described as legitimately impressive, which means a lot coming from me. She brought 2 graduate students and a methodology that was rigorous enough to produce publishable results and practical enough to be useful to the people doing the actual consultation work. The study's focus was the gap, the specific documentable gap between equipment diagnostics and user-reported outcomes. 12 months of data collection. Every client who came through the center was offered enrollment. Participation was voluntary and clearly explained by Greta, who had a particular gift for informed consent conversations that felt human rather than procedural. By the 3rd month, the data was already telling a story. 73% of enrolled clients had prior diagnostic records showing equipment within specification. 68% of those clients reported symptom resolution or significant improvement following center intervention. The correlation was, in Dr. Mehta's careful academic language, strongly suggestive of a systematic gap in standard diagnostic methodology. In plain language, the standard tools were missing real problems at a rate that was not random noise. It was a pattern, and the pattern had a cost, measured in pain, in lost function, in the shrinking of lives that happened when the equipment supposed to expand your world was quietly, precisely, making it smaller instead. Mason sat with Dr. Mehta's monthly reports in the same way he sat with everything he needed to understand, carefully, without rushing, reading past the language to what the numbers were actually saying. He was not a researcher. He was not going to pretend to be. But he knew how to ask the right questions, and he knew how to recognize when data matched what he'd felt in his hands. It matched. Avery came to the center on a Tuesday in October, exactly 1 year, almost to the week, from the morning she'd arrived at Reed's garage with Vanessa and the black SUV and the chair that hurt. She didn't announce it as an anniversary. She just came in with coffee, 2 cups, from the place 3 blocks away that Mason had mentioned once and she'd remembered, and found him in the consultation room reviewing a case file. He looked up, took the coffee. "Thank you." She settled across from him. The chair, her chair, the one that had been recalibrated in his garage at midnight, the one that had not hurt her since, moved with the ease of something finally doing exactly what it was meant to do. "I was thinking about this morning last year," she said, "when you came to the garage. When I came to the garage." She looked at the coffee cup. I had been so careful for so long about not expecting anything. Not from another appointment, not from another review. I had filed the hope away somewhere because the hope kept costing me more than I had." She paused. "I was expecting you to look at the chair and tell me everything was fine. You didn't show it." "I know. I'd gotten good at not showing it." She looked at him. "When did you know that something was actually wrong?" "When I heard the motor," he said, 30 seconds into looking at it. She nodded slowly. "And you didn't say anything yet." "I needed to be sure first. Saying something before you're sure," he paused. "It's a different kind of dismissal, raising someone's hopes and then not delivering. I'd rather be certain." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a very specific form of care," she said. "The restraint part." He looked at her. "Is that good or bad?" "It's what I needed," she said. "So it was good." She set down her coffee cup. "Vanessa called me this morning, early." "About what?" "She wanted to talk about the center, and also—" She hesitated, which was unusual enough that Mason paid closer attention. "She wanted to say something she'd been holding for a while. She said—" Avery stopped, started again. "She said that she'd spent the last 4 years managing my life from the outside, making calls, sitting in appointments, coordinating everything. And she thought she was doing it right because she was doing everything she could think of to do." Mason waited. "And she said she realized, watching what happened with the chair and with the center, that she'd been managing everything except the thing I actually needed most, which was someone to tell me my experience was real." Avery's voice was even, but there was something beneath it. Not fragility, but the quality of something that had been held for a long time and was being set down. "She said she was sorry, that she had been so focused on fixing things that she forgot to believe me." The room was quiet. "What did you say?" Mason asked. "I said I didn't need the apology." She paused. "That's not quite right. I said I understood why it happened. That we're both people who solve problems. That sometimes the solving is easier than the sitting with someone in what's not yet solved." She looked at the window. "We're working on it, both of us." Mason thought about Vanessa in the doorway of his garage on the Thursday of the Nexar meeting, saying 17 people over 8 months with a voice he hadn't heard from her before. The armored sister, meeting the thing she'd been armored against. "She's a good person," he said. "She is," Avery agreed. "She's also extremely difficult to argue with, which I say as someone who's tried." He smiled. "So are you." "I know." She said it without apology. "It runs in the family." They sat for a while. The center's sounds moved around them. Greta in the other consultation room, a conversation, the workshop sounds from the back where Denny was doing something with a calibration rig he'd built himself over the summer. The ordinary sounds of a place that was doing something real. "Can I tell you something?" Avery said. "Yeah. Coming back to my life, functionally, I mean. Being able to work full days, go to things I'd stopped going to, think clearly without the constant management of the pain in the background." She paused. "It took a while to adjust to. You'd think you'd just be grateful, and I am. But there's also this period of recalibration, of remembering who you were before you started shrinking around the pain." Mason said nothing. He was listening. "I'd given up things," she said. "Small things, mostly. A morning run I'd done for years, adapted to a different form after the injury, and then stopped altogether because the chair pain made mornings so difficult. Certain clients I'd stopped meeting in person. A community board I'd resigned from because the evening hours felt like too much." She looked at her hands. "Getting those things back isn't as simple as just doing them again. You have to relearn that you're allowed to." "Are you?" he asked. "Getting them back?" "Slowly, yes." She looked up. "I went back to the board in August. First meeting, I showed up and someone said, 'We're so glad you're back,' and I had to sit with that for a second because part of me expected them to have a different reaction, expected to have to prove that I should be there." She paused. "That reflex, the defensive one, takes a while to stop." "It probably doesn't fully stop," Mason said. "You just get faster at catching it." She looked at him. "Is that from experience?" He thought about Julie leaving, about the specific reflex he'd developed in the year after, the checking, the waiting for the next thing to fall apart, the way he'd structured his life around reliability and predictability as a hedge against chaos. He was aware he still had versions of that reflex. He was aware he'd gotten faster at catching it. "Yeah," he said, "a little." Ethan turned 9 in November. His request for his birthday was to visit the center, not as a birthday activity, exactly, but because he'd been asking to come for months, and Mason had been putting it off in the vague way of parents who are managing too much to add one more thing, even a good thing. The birthday provided a deadline. They came on a Saturday when the center was closed and Mason had a key and the place was theirs alone. Ethan walked through every room with the focused attention of someone conducting an inspection, asking questions about the equipment in the workshop with a specificity that impressed Denny when Mason relayed it later. In the consultation room, Ethan sat in one of the chairs and looked around. "This is where you talk to people?" he asked. "This is where we start," Mason said. "We talk about what's been happening, what they're experiencing, what hasn't worked, and then you fix it?" "We try. Sometimes we fix the equipment. Sometimes we figure out what the real problem is and connect them with someone else who can help with that part." Ethan considered this. What if you can't fix it? It was, Mason thought, the right question to ask. The realistic one. "Then we try to make it better than it was," he said. "And we tell them the truth about what we found, so they're not going in blind." Ethan nodded, apparently satisfied. "Dad," he said in the tone of someone transitioning to a different subject. "Yeah. Do you like Avery?" Mason looked at his son. Ethan was looking at the wall with the studied neutrality of someone who has asked a question and is pretending they're not listening for the answer. "Yeah," Mason said. "I do." "Like, as a person, or?" Ethan moved his hand in a circle that apparently substituted for a more specific question. "Both, probably." Ethan nodded again slowly. "I think she's good," he said, not elaborating, not needing to. "Yeah," Mason said. "Me too." "Okay." Ethan stood up, apparently done with the conversation. "Can we go get lunch? I want the place with the good fries." The conversation Mason had with Avery in December wasn't planned. She came by the center on a Wednesday afternoon that had no particular agenda. She did this sometimes, the stopping by, and he had stopped analyzing it because the analysis kept arriving at the same place, and he knew what the place was. She found him in the workshop. He was working on a calibration problem with a client's chair, different from hers, different mechanism, but a similar principle. The equipment doing something technically correct that was wrong for the person using it. He explained what he was seeing. She listened with the specific attention she brought to things she was genuinely interested in. "You're good at explaining this," she said. "I've had practice." "No, but I mean to the clients. The way you explain what you found. You make it legible without making it condescending. She paused. Most people who are good at something don't know how to do that. My dad was like that. He could explain anything to anyone. You mention him sometimes. He was worth mentioning. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't have a father who explained things, she said. It came out simply, without performance. He had a lot of expectations and not much language for the gap between what he expected and what was actually happening. She paused. Vanessa and I both learned to manage ourselves early. Figure things out, not ask for help. How's that working for you, Sid? He said, and there was no edge in it, just the question. She almost smiled. Approximately, better than it did. She looked at her hands. I've been thinking about something. Tell me. I've been thinking that I spend a lot of time being careful about things, calibrating, making sure I understand the terms of something before I commit to them. She looked up at him. And I think sometimes the calibration is necessary and right. And sometimes it's just the reflex, the protective one. And it's hard to tell the difference from the inside. Mason set down the tool in his hand. He turned to face her fully. What are you saying? He asked, because she'd earned directness, and so had he. I'm saying I'd like to stop calibrating this, she said. Whatever this is, I'd like to just be in it and see what it is. He looked at her for a long moment. The workshop was quiet around them, the afternoon light coming in through the high windows that Denny had insisted on for the equipment visibility, but that also, it turned out, made the room feel more human at certain hours. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. That's not a very dramatic response. No, he agreed, but it's what I mean. She looked at him, and the complicated expression was there again, the one that was several things at once, but this time it settled. Not into certainty, not into the clean resolution of solved problems, just into something that had room in it, space for what was actually there. There's something people don't talk about enough when they talk about being listened to. It's not the moment of being heard. Though that matters, and it's real, and for Avery, that October morning in the garage had been a thing she would carry without diminishment for the rest of her life. It's what happens after. The slow reconstruction of the thing that gets unmade when you're consistently not believed. The relearning that your body's evidence is valid, that your experience of your own life is the primary data, not a thing to be checked against external authority before it becomes real. That reconstruction is quiet work. It doesn't look like much from the outside. It looks like someone going back to a community board, or taking a different route to work because they feel like it, or sitting in a restaurant for 3 hours because the chair doesn't hurt and there's nowhere to be. It looks like calling your sister at 8 in the morning just to talk, because the urgency has gone out of the space between you. Mason understood this about the center in a way he hadn't understood it at the beginning. He'd started thinking of it as a repair service, which it was, technically. The equipment work was real and necessary, but the equipment was only part of what was being fixed. The other part was harder to name in a grant application or a research study, though Dr. Mehta was working on language for it. The other part was what happened to people when someone sat across from them and said, I hear you. What you're experiencing is real. Let's find out what's causing it. It sounds simple. It isn't simple. It requires a particular kind of commitment, not just to the diagnostic process, but to the person, to the belief that the person's report of their own experience is the starting point, not the thing to be verified. Mason had learned this from his father's garage, from years of treating engines as systems that were trying to communicate something. He hadn't known, until Avery, that the same quality translated. That listening, real listening, the kind without an agenda, was a skill that worked across everything it was applied to. He thought about this sometimes in the small hours, when the garage was quiet and the center's files were on his desk, and Ethan was asleep, and the life that had been available to him 6 months ago was visibly different from the life available now. He thought about how close he'd come to not stopping, to looking at the black SUV in his lot and the expensive chair and thinking, not my area, not my problem. He'd almost said exactly that. The words had been in his mouth. He hadn't said them because of a sound, a faint mechanical asymmetry in a motor housing that nobody else had thought to listen for. There was something in that, something worth sitting with. How much turns on very small things? How much of what matters gets decided in the 30 seconds before you choose to pay attention or choose to move on? The accumulation of those seconds across a life, the ones where you looked and the ones where you looked away, adds up to something. He wasn't sure what to call it exactly. Not destiny, not luck. Something more like character, revealed in accumulation rather than in any single dramatic choice. Ethan had his father's quality of paying attention. Mason had noticed this with the particular mixture of pride and anxiety that parents feel when they see themselves clearly in their children. The kid noticed things. He asked about them. He didn't look away from what was uncomfortable when looking at it was more useful than not. He was going to be okay, this kid. More than okay. He was going to be exactly himself, which was already considerable. The first year's data from Dr. Mehta's study was published in a peer-reviewed journal in January. The headline finding that standard equipment diagnostics missed clinically significant fit issues in a majority of the studied population landed with enough weight in the rehabilitation engineering community to generate a response. Some of it was defensive, some of it was thoughtful. A conference panel was organized. Denny was invited to present and did so with the specific energy of someone who has been waiting their entire career to say something and has now been given a microphone. Nexar reached out in February, not through legal channels but directly, Sandra Chu calling Avery's phone, asking if she would be willing to consult on their new patient escalation protocol. Avery said she'd have to think about it. She thought about it for 3 days and then said yes, with conditions, which Claire Sue helped her draft. The conditions were accepted. The center treated its 100th client in March. Greta marked it by bringing in a cake that said 100 on it, which Ethan found when he came in after school and ate 2 pieces of while doing homework at the front desk, because he was there often enough that it had become a kind of second home, the way garages had been Mason's second home growing up. Not everything was resolved. Not everything was clean. Mason and Avery were still figuring out the shape of what they were, not rushing it, not avoiding it, but letting it be what it was while also being what it was, which is how real things tend to go when people are paying attention and not forcing the story into a form it hasn't grown into yet. Vanessa would call this insufficient resolution. She said so, once. Avery told her some things resolve in their own time and not in yours. Vanessa said that was either wisdom or avoidance. Avery said it was probably a little of both. Some days the center was too much. Some days the garage felt like the right size of life, and the center felt like something he was growing into unevenly, filling a shape that was bigger than he was comfortable with. Mason knew this about himself and let Greta and Denny carry what they were better suited to carry and tried to stay in his lane without using the lane as an excuse to not grow. Robert Chu, the first client, the man with the back pain, came back in April for a follow-up. He walked in without the particular careful movement Mason had noticed at their first meeting, the small conservation of energy that people develop when they're in chronic pain and learn to spend their body's resources carefully. He sat down, talked about how the months had gone. The pain was mostly managed, not gone, he said, because the underlying condition had its own facts that weren't going away, but manageable in a way that had given him back things he'd stopped expecting to have. He'd gone back to work. He'd started cooking again, which he'd apparently loved and abandoned somewhere in the second year of the pain. I made my mother's recipe last week, he said at one point, and then stopped. And Mason understood from the stopping that the recipe meant something specific to something lost, and he didn't push, just let it be what it was. At the end of the appointment, Robert stood to leave and then paused in the doorway. The same pause as 8 months ago, the same place. I want to ask you something, he said. Okay. When I came in the first time, you spent 2 hours just asking me questions before you touched the equipment. He paused. Why do you do it that way? Mason thought about how to answer. Because the equipment is only part of the story, he said. The person using it is the other part. And if you don't know the second part, the first part doesn't mean what you think it means. Robert nodded slowly. That seems obvious when you say it. It does, Mason agreed. It's not obvious to everyone. Robert left. Mason stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the parking lot, at the accessible spaces properly marked, at the trees beginning their spring work along Carpenter Road. A year ago, he'd been standing in a different doorway, looking at a different lot, watching a ramp come down from a black SUV and feeling the pull of a problem he hadn't asked for. He'd spent a lot of his life not asking for things to find him. Work found him. Problems found him. The right complications at the right time. He'd learned to trust that pull, not because it was mystical, but because it was informational. The same way a sound from a motor housing was information, even when nothing on the diagnostic report flagged it. Your instincts, if you've developed them over time and kept them honest, are data. Avery was in the conference room, working. She came in on Tuesdays now, ran some of her company's business from the center because the commute made sense and because, she said when he asked, she liked the quality of attention in the building. Something about it made her think better. He was aware he was not supposed to be too pleased about this, and was pleased about it anyway. He went and knocked on the conference room door. She looked up. "Robert just left," he said. "How was he?" "Good. He cooked his mother's recipe." She understood what that meant without needing elaboration, which was one of the things about her that he kept noticing. The way she could receive a partial thing and complete it correctly, because she was paying attention to the shape of what was said and not just the content. "Good," she said. He stood in the doorway. She looked at him with the directness that was simply who she was. No performance in it, no softening, no presentation. Just her, looking at him clearly. "You want coffee?" he asked. "I already have some." "I was going to get some anyway." She smiled. The real one. "Then go get it." He went. The center was doing its work around him. Greta's voice from the consultation room, Denny doing something precise and probably argumentative with the calibration equipment. The afternoon settling toward its later hours, the light on Carpenter Road going gold in the particular way of early spring, when the world is doing something you can feel before you can see it. He made the coffee. He thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. He thought about a father's hands and a son's certainty and a woman's note hidden in the back of a binder because she had run out of places to put the truth. He thought about the sound in the motor housing, the small wrongness that nobody else had heard, the 30 seconds in which he decided to pay attention. He poured the coffee, carried it back. Some things begin with the willingness to listen, not with expertise or credentials or the right equipment, though those matter and they help. But before any of that, before the tools and the methodology and the formal process, there is always the moment of choice, the moment when you can walk away from the difficult thing or you can stay and hear it out. Mason Reed had stayed. Everything that followed was what staying looked like, unfolding day by day into a life that was harder and fuller and more worth the trouble than the one he'd had before. Not perfect. Not without its costs or complications, or the occasional morning where it felt like too much. But real, in the way that things are real when you've built them honestly, with other people, without pretending the gaps weren't there. He brought Avery the coffee. She took it, didn't look up from what she was working on. "Thank you," she said. "Sure," he said, and went back to work. Outside, the spring was getting on with itself, unhurried and without ceremony. The way most important things proceed when no one's making a performance out of them.